She stepped into the elevator, and I said it before I'd decided to say it. That dress is going to be a problem at work. She put her hand on the door to hold it. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. Not the hurt kind of look, not the confused kind, but the kind that means someone has heard a thing and is deciding whether it deserves a response. Then she let the door go. "Then don't look," she said. "The door's closed." I stood in the hallway of the 6th floor and held the shape of that sentence for a long moment. The specific moment when you replay what just happened and it becomes more accurate each time rather than less, until you arrive at the precise version of what you actually said and what it actually was. Not what you intended, not what you were trying to gesture at, but the sentence itself, in the air where it was said, to the person it was said to. Not what you meant, what it was. Those are not the same thing, and the elevator door had just closed between me and someone with whom I was now certain they were not the same thing. What I'd said was not about the dress. I had known that while I was saying it. That's the particular cruelty of a sentence that comes out as its own opposite. You understand what you're doing while you're doing it. Some part of you watches the sentence leave your mouth in exactly the wrong form and knows it's wrong and says it anyway, because the machinery of the moment is already in motion, and stopping it would require a kind of honesty you don't have available on a 6th-floor hallway at 7:45 in the morning. So out it comes, the worst possible form of the thing that was true, and then you stand in the hallway with it. I stood there about 30 seconds, then I went back to my apartment, sat on the edge of my bed, and had an honest conversation with myself that I should have been having in some form or another for considerably longer than I had been. Her name was Simone Okafor. She'd moved into apartment 6D 14 months ago, and I'd been in 6B long enough that I knew most of what there was to know about the 6th floor. Which neighbor left packages blocking the elevator, which ones had early alarms you could hear through the walls on weekdays, which ones came home late on Thursday nights with the sound of keys taking 3 attempts. When Simone moved in, I knew her schedule within a week. We left for work at nearly the same time most mornings, give or take 10 minutes depending on whether she'd had a good sleep or was running behind. And I knew her coffee order within a month because we started stopping at the cart on the corner together, which was a casual thing at first and became a regular thing quickly, and then became the part of my morning I noticed most when it didn't happen. We worked at the same company, 12 blocks from the building, a coincidence that became less surprising the longer I thought about it, given the size of the company and the density of the neighborhood, but that had produced a specific and unusual situation. Someone who was a genuine friend and a genuine colleague and a genuine neighbor, which meant the ordinary categories didn't quite apply. She worked in strategy. I was in finance. Our work overlapped at the edges of major projects we were both tangentially attached to, which meant we were in enough of the same rooms to have opinions about each other's work, and different enough in our actual day-to-day to not be in each other's way professionally. The shorthand between us was not the kind that develops between colleagues. It was closer to the kind that develops between people who have been honest with each other across multiple contexts, about different kinds of things, over enough time that the honesty has become a habit rather than a choice. She'd told me, in the past 14 months, things she hadn't told people she'd known longer. About her father's illness in the winter, which she'd managed from a distance and said nothing about at work. And I'd only learned because she'd come down to the lobby one morning with her phone in her hand and told me about the call she'd just gotten, and I'd sat with her on the steps in front of the building for 20 minutes before she said she was ready to go in. About the decision to end the last relationship, which she'd described with a clarity that suggested she'd been holding the reasoning for a long time before she said it, that the decision was old before it became a conversation. About what she wanted in 5 years, specific, concrete, named without apology, which was the way she approached most things she cared about. I'd told her things too. It's harder to remember them specifically because what I shared felt smaller, in retrospect, given what she gave me to hold. But I remember the texture of those mornings at the corner cart, the specific quality of her attention. She listened to things fully, and came back with something that made you understand she'd been thinking about what you said, rather than waiting for her turn to talk. I remember one morning in March when I told her about a decision I was trying to make about whether to apply for a different role at a different firm, and she asked me 3 questions, and by the 3rd question I'd understood that the decision had already been made and I'd been looking for someone to show me how to see it. I didn't apply, I've thought about that morning several times since, about what it means to be asked the right questions by someone who doesn't have a stake in the answer. I had been careful, in the other sense, the whole 14 months. She was brilliant at her job in the way that makes certain people uncomfortable. She tracked the implications of decisions further out than most rooms were following, and she said so when asked, without the particular hedging that makes someone easier to be around and less useful to listen to. She'd been at the company 4 years. She was up for a senior strategy position that would give her 3 direct reports and a seat at the project leadership table, and she was the obvious choice for it in the way that doesn't always translate into getting the thing, because obvious choice and inevitable choice are different mechanisms and one of them has interference patterns the other doesn't. Warren Fitch was one of those interference patterns. He'd been a senior director for 11 years, which is long enough that you stop being evaluated against criteria and become one of the criteria yourself. He had a specific instinct for identifying people who were going to be exceptional at the kind of work he was average at, and an equally reliable instinct for protecting his position against that exceptionalism before it became visible enough to compare. He wasn't obvious about it. He had a vocabulary of culture fit and stakeholder management and communication style that he deployed with the fluency of someone who has been using institutional language as a weapon for so long that he no longer thinks of it as a weapon. He'd begun raising concerns about Simone 6 months ago. I'd heard about it through the particular second-hand channel that exists in every organization. Not rumor, more like the way information surfaces when 2 people both know something and one of them wants the other to know they know it, without saying it directly. 2 different people had mentioned the concerns to me in 2 separate conversations, in the careful way that signals, this is real, this is moving, and I'm flagging it for your awareness without putting my name on the flag. Warren had raised to the head of strategy and the director of people operations a pattern of concerns around Simone's conduct and communication style that in the language of performance management could mean exactly what it sounds like, or mean nothing at all, depending on the documentation behind it and who was being asked. I'd been watching Warren for 6 months in the way you watch something that you're fairly certain is happening and haven't found the right way to address. He was careful. He never said anything that couldn't be read as genuine professional concern by someone who didn't have the full context. In meetings he was collegial toward her, agreeable, sometimes even complimentary, in the same way that someone skilled at this particular kind of maneuvering knows that the formal record and the room's impression need to diverge carefully and over time. It was the combination of the warmth in the room and the language in the documentation that told you what was happening. One of those things was real. The other was management. I'd been thinking about it for 6 months without an action point. And I had not been telling Simone because telling her would have required explaining how I knew, and explaining how I knew would have required explaining what I'd been paying attention to and why, and that conversation opened into a different one that I'd been carefully not having. I took the next elevator. By the time I reached the lobby, she was gone, visible through the glass doors, already half a block ahead, walking at the pace she walks when she's working through something, and the movement is part of the thinking. I let the block of distance stay between us. The walk to the corner, then to the office, was 12 minutes on a normal morning. This was not a normal morning, and I needed those 12 minutes to be spent not making things worse, so I took a slightly longer route and arrived 4 minutes after her. We were in the same building for 7 hours and did not speak directly once. This is easier in a large office than it sounds. She sat on 4, I sat on 7, our calendars didn't intersect that day, and the building cafe has enough square footage that eating at different tables doesn't read as deliberate to anyone watching. I was deliberate. I ate at a table near the back window and looked at my phone more than my food, and thought about what I'd said and why, and then thought about it again from a different angle, and arrived at the same answer every time, which is the kind of thinking that is useful and miserable in equal measure. I had 2 morning meetings I was mostly present for, a 10:30 that I was less present for in the second half, when one of the other attendees used the phrase communication style in a way that wasn't about Simone, and that I nonetheless spent the next 8 minutes sitting with. A 2 o'clock where I took notes I'd have to clean up later because they contained several places where I'd clearly stopped tracking the conversation mid-sentence. I drafted an email 3 times. Not a work email, the other kind, the kind you draft during a workday, that you know is not a workday email, and that you're not going to send from your work account regardless. The first draft was too explanatory. The second was too brief, which made it read as dismissive, in the way that brief things read when the topic isn't brief. The third started correctly and ran out of honesty about 2/3 of the way through, and I deleted it and decided I needed to talk to her in person, and that this was not the right day for that either, and I put the phone face down and finished the 2 o'clock. At 11:45 the following morning, I'd had a difficult night and a worse morning, and had not gone to the corner cart. My phone lit up with a text from Simone. "Can you eat lunch today? Building Cafe. There's something I need to tell you. Not, we should talk. Not, about this morning. Something I need to tell you. A separate topic, distinct from the hallway, with its own urgency." I stared at the text for a moment, understanding that whatever this was, it had arrived during the day and was large enough to require an in-person conversation on short notice. I wrote back, "I'll be there at 12. She was already at the corner table when I arrived, the kind of table you choose when you want to see the room and not be overheard, tucked against the back wall with the chair facing the entrance. She had a coffee and an untouched plate, and the particular focused stillness she gets when she's processing something, and the processing hasn't finished. "Warren filed with HR this morning," she said, without preamble. I sat down. "Formally?" I asked. "A written complaint. Professionalism and conduct concerns." She said it in the register of someone who has been sitting with information long enough that the shock is gone, and what's left is just the weight of it. He cited the alderman-client meeting as a specific incident. He described my behavior as aggressive and inappropriately casual given the stakes of the engagement. She looked at her coffee. "The meeting where I corrected his projected numbers and the client agreed with my correction in front of his team." I looked at her. "He filed because you were right. He filed because I was right in front of the client," she said, which is apparently a distinction that matters in his view of how things should work. She picked up the coffee and set it down without drinking it. "There's an HR review. Friday afternoon. If a conduct finding goes on my record before the promotion decision is made." She stopped. She didn't need to finish. A conduct finding wouldn't end her career, but it would end this particular door, and this door was 4 years of work she had been building toward. "What does your documentation look like?" I asked. The look she gave me had something in it I hadn't seen from her before, a slight recalibration, as though she'd prepared to explain something and found the explanation wasn't needed. "More than he thinks," she said. She'd been keeping records since February, when she'd understood that the communication concerns weren't going to stop at being concerns and weren't genuinely about communication. A folder on her personal drive, nothing on the company system. She'd been careful about that from the beginning, because she understood that anything on a company system belongs to the company, and anything the company owns can be accessed by people who are not on her side, with dates, summaries of specific interactions, and wherever possible the exact language used. She'd been methodical about it in the way she was methodical about analysis, complete, time-stamped, sourced, and organized in a way that told a story when you read it in sequence rather than a collection of individual incidents that could each be explained away. She showed me the folder on her phone. It had 43 entries over 9 months. They ranged from brief, a 2-sentence record of a comment made in a hallway that she'd documented because it fit the pattern, even though it was too minor to matter alone, to detailed reconstructions of specific meetings, including the alderman presentation. Her alderman notes were written the same evening of the meeting, the slide deck, Warren's figures, the specific projection he'd presented and the actual figure she'd put next to it, and the percentage difference between them, what the client's lead said when she finished, what Warren said afterward, and how he said it. The notes were detailed enough that reading them reconstructed the meeting with the specificity of a contemporaneous record rather than a memory. "Does your attorney know you have all of this?" I asked. "She's seen parts. We're going through the rest today." She scrolled through it. "The pattern is documented. 9 months of documented pattern. The problem is that a pattern documented by me is still a one-sided account, and the other side has institutional credibility and 11 years of relationships." She put her phone face down. "I need something that exists outside my perspective. Something that makes clear the complaint was designed rather than responsive. The problem," she said, "is that my documentation is all from my perspective. I have a pattern, but the pattern is documented by me, about him." That's useful, but it can be dismissed as a one-sided account of professional disagreements. She looked at the table. What I need is something that shows the complaints aren't genuine, that they were designed before the incidents they're responding to. Something that makes it a strategy rather than a concern. She looked at me when she said that last sentence, and I understood she wasn't asking if I had something. She didn't know I had something. She was thinking out loud, working through what was missing, and I was sitting across from her knowing exactly what was missing. I had been sitting on it for 6 weeks. The email had arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks ago, at 7:14, when I was still in bed going through overnight messages before I got up. It was from Warren Fitch, addressed to the head of strategy and the director of people operations, with my name in the CC line. It was a mistake. There was another person in my department, different division, different floor, whose last name was one letter different from mine, and Warren had apparently used autocomplete on the CC field and gotten the wrong contact. The email arrived. I opened it. Within the first sentence I understood it wasn't meant for me. I read it anyway. 3 paragraphs. The first discussed the promotion cycle and Warren's belief that the senior strategy position required someone whose instincts around stakeholder relationships reflected the culture of the senior leadership team, the kind of sentence that sounds like a position paper until you understand what it's a position paper against. The second was more specific, his concerns about Simone, but not the vocabulary of process version, the actual version, with the logic behind it spelled out in a way he would never have written if he'd known I was reading it. He described her as someone whose track record showed excellent individual work and genuine analytical capability, combined with a pattern of behavior in group settings that he believed would create long-term friction at the senior level. He wasn't wrong that she created friction. She created friction because she was right more often than people comfortable in that environment were used to accommodating. He had correctly identified the thing and was planning to use it to stop her from getting the thing she'd earned. The third paragraph was the one I had read 3 times. I think it's worth getting something formally documented before the decision window closes, so there's a record that the question was raised. The alderman presentation seems like a natural opening. I'll follow up. I had taken a screenshot before I closed the email. I had not replied. There's no version of responding to a message received by mistake that doesn't create its own set of problems, and the problems created by my replying were problems I would have had to explain to Simone, which meant explaining what I'd been paying attention to and why, which opened into the conversation I'd been carefully not having. I had not forwarded it to her. I had told myself it wasn't mine to forward, that acting on a misdirected email without the intended recipient's knowledge was the kind of unilateral decision that required more certainty than I had, that the right move was to hold it and see if it became relevant. That was what I told myself across 6 weeks of the screenshot sitting in my personal cloud storage. The honest version is simpler. I didn't know what to do with it, and I was comfortable enough with my own inaction to keep being inactive, and 6 weeks passed in the way 6 weeks pass when you have decided not to decide something. It had mattered from the day it arrived. I simply hadn't made it matter. I have an email, I said. She went very still. What kind of email? The kind where he lays out the plan in advance of the incident he then cited in his complaint, including the sentence, "The alderman presentation seems like a natural opening. I'll follow up." She looked at me for a long moment. The cafe noise continued around us, indifferent. "How long have you had it?" she asked. 6 weeks. "You didn't tell me." "No. I didn't try to dress it up. I held it because I didn't know what to do with it. And then I kept holding it. And here we are." I looked at her. "I should have told you." That's the straightforward version. She was quiet, doing the active work that silence does when the information arriving requires the kind of processing that can't be rushed. "Send it to me," she said. "Now." I sent it from my personal phone. She opened it, read it once, read the 3rd paragraph again, and called her attorney. The call lasted 9 minutes. Simone took it on the sidewalk outside the cafe, visible through the glass, her free hand flat against the building wall and her face doing the precise stillness of someone who is listening at full capacity and translating what they hear into a sequence of actions in real time. She came back in and sat down without her coat fully adjusted. There was something different in her expression. Not relief, not yet, but the look of someone who has just had a piece of information land in exactly the right slot of the frame they'd been building for 9 months, and can now see how the frame becomes a case. She says the email is significant. The natural opening, "I'll follow up" line documents premeditation. He wrote his intention to create a formal record before the incident he used to create the formal record. Combined with my folder, it makes the complaint look like the culmination of a plan rather than a response to behavior. She looked at her hands. She's filing the response today. She's also requesting that the Friday review be deferred pending an investigation into the origins and intent of the complaint. What happens to Warren? That depends on what they find when they look, she said it calmly. The email alone, with my documentation of the pattern, should be enough to shift the framing from an inquiry into my conduct to an inquiry into his. His complaint says I behaved inappropriately at the alderman meeting. His own email says he identified that meeting as a natural opening 6 weeks before the complaint was filed. She looked at me. Those two facts do not coexist comfortably. The cafe was doing its lunch noise around us, which felt like exactly the right backdrop. "I'm sorry I sat on it," I said. "I know." She picked up her fork and finally ate something, the first bite since I'd sat down, which is how I understood that the worst of the immediate pressure had passed. Not finished, not resolved, but past the point where food was impossible. Thank you for not sitting on it any longer. The review was deferred by Thursday morning, pending a preliminary inquiry into the complaint's origins. By Thursday afternoon, the inquiry had become a formal investigation, not into Simone's conduct, but into the circumstances surrounding the filing, its timing relative to the promotion decision, its relationship to the pattern of prior concerns Warren had raised, and the degree to which the alderman meeting had been identified as an opportunity before it occurred. I provided a written statement, the date and time I received the email, that it had arrived in error, its contents in full, and my decision to retain a screenshot of it after reading it. The statement took 3 drafts to get right, for different reasons than the drafts I'd deleted earlier in the week. Warren's attorney entered the picture and the investigation moved at the pace. Investigations move when attorneys are involved on both sides. These things take the time they take. This one took 3 weeks, during which the promotion decision was formally separated from Warren's influence and assigned to a panel that was convened specifically to remove him from the process. The panel reviewed the candidates, the qualifications, and the documentation of the campaign that had been waged against the most qualified one, and made their decision without reference to communication style concerns or stakeholder relationship questions or any of the other vocabulary that had been deployed over 9 months to mean something it was never stated to mean. The offer letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week. She called me from the lobby of our building. I was in my apartment and I heard her voice in the hallway through the door before I heard my phone ring. I opened the door and she was standing in the hall with her phone in her hand, and the specific expression of someone who has received something they worked very hard for and is still waiting for it to feel entirely real. "Senior Strategy Director," she said. "That's what you are," I said. She looked at me. Then she laughed, the kind that arrives before you've decided to allow it, and said, "Yes, it is." And we stood in the 6th floor hallway, in almost exactly the spot where the elevator door had closed between us, and the distance between that morning and this one felt much larger than 4 weeks. She made dinner on a Friday, at her place, the week after the letter, a plan that had been set since the day it arrived and that neither of us had suggested canceling. We ate at her kitchen table with the window open and the early fall dark coming in, and the ease that settles over a meal when both people at the table are where they want to be and are not pretending otherwise. Somewhere in the second glass of wine she said, "The dress." "Yes," I said. "Do you want to tell me what that actually was?" "I do." I looked at the table. "Then it wasn't about the dress." "I know it wasn't about the dress." She said it calmly, without the edge the sentence could have carried. "I've had 4 weeks to think about it." "Well, I want your version." I looked at the window, at the early dark, at the kitchen table that was hers and that I had sat at before, and at which I was now going to have a conversation that was probably 4 weeks overdue and possibly 14 months overdue, depending on how far back you wanted to start the clock. "I've been careful around you," I said, deliberately, for a long time, because you are a lot in the way that makes you impossible to be around neutrally. And I had made a decision not to say that, and I'd been executing that decision successfully for about 14 months, until that morning. When you stepped into the elevator in that dress and I saw you very clearly for a second, and what came out of my mouth was the control version of what I was actually feeling. I looked at her, which is the worst possible form it could have taken, because of what it sounded like. Because of what it sounds like from any man who has ever told you how you should present yourself. Because I'd spent 6 months watching Warren Fitch use exactly that kind of language to undermine you professionally, and on that particular morning what came out of my mouth was structurally identical to his. She was quiet. I know what I sounded like, I said. I know the sentence I said is the sentence someone says when they want to manage another person's appearance because it serves them, not her. And I said it, and it came from a completely different place, and that doesn't matter, because the sentence is the sentence regardless of where it came from. No, she said, it matters. She looked at me steadily. The sentence was wrong and I was right to shut the door on it. Both of those things are true. And also, the place it came from is relevant to what we do with it now. She picked up her glass. You said it came from seeing me very clearly. Yes, say that part, without the wrong version of it. I looked at her, at the kitchen table that was completely hers, that had become a table I sat at, that was becoming over the course of the evening something I thought of differently than I'd thought of it this morning or the morning before. At the person who had shut an elevator door on me 4 weeks ago and given me the space to understand what I'd said and why. Not by explaining it, not by managing it toward a resolution, just by closing the door and going to work, and letting the understanding happen on the timeline it needed. I have been, for 14 months, trying very hard not to be in love with you, I said. The trying has been successful in the sense that I haven't said it. Less successful in most other ways, including apparently the morning I said the wrong version of it at the elevator. She was quiet for a moment. Looking at me the way she looked at things she was thinking carefully about. The 14 months, she said. You've been careful the whole time. Yes. Because of what exactly? Neighboring? Working together? Because I didn't want to be the thing that complicated something that was good, I said. The mornings, the work conversations. What we had was, I didn't want to put something on it that would change it if it went wrong. That's a reasonable thing to protect, she said. It's also how you lose 14 months. I looked at her. I'm aware of both of those things. She looked at her wine glass. I've been careful around you for about 8 months, she said, in case that's useful information. The morning you told me about the other job at the other firm, when you decided not to apply. I understood something that morning and I've been managing it since then. She looked at me. With varying degrees of success. 8 months, I said. 8 months, she confirmed. So you were careful for 6 months before I started being careful, which means we've been being careful at each other for a while. That seems like a waste of time in retrospect. It does. She wasn't quite smiling, but she was close. It's also how you end up with 14 months of knowing someone in a way that makes everything else in the conversation easier. So, she picked up her glass. It's not only a waste, she set it down. Then don't look, she said. I should tell you. That was not only a shutdown. You said it might be an invitation. I said possibly, she looked at me. I'm saying now that it was definitely one. I was angry and I closed the door, and both of those things were the right response, and also, it was an invitation. Both things were true at the same time. She contains multitudes, I said. She has always been clear about this, she said. What I've been thinking about since then is the specific failure of saying something real in the wrong form. How a true feeling can arrive in language that means its opposite, and how the opposite is what the other person has to respond to, because that's what was said. You don't get credit for what you meant. You get credit for what you said, and what you do with it afterward. She was right to close the door. She was right to let me stand in the hallway with the exact sentence I'd said until I understood what it was. You can't say the right thing before you've understood what made you say the wrong one. She didn't explain this to me. She didn't walk me through the reasoning. She just shut the elevator door and went to work, and let the understanding happen on its own schedule, without managing it or mediating it or making it easier than it needed to be real. That's the part I keep coming back to, the closed door itself. The decision not to explain it to me. Most people, faced with a sentence that landed badly, would have some version of an immediate conversation. Clarify, address, resolve. She didn't do that. She closed the door and went to work, which is a kind of clarity that requires being very sure of yourself, sure enough not to need the resolution on your timeline, sure enough to let the other person find their way to the right understanding instead of being steered there. I spent the better part of 4 weeks understanding what I'd said, and why I'd said it, and why it was wrong regardless of where it came from. The why matters, but it doesn't change the what, and the what has to be accounted for before the why gets to mean anything. At the end of 4 weeks, I had the version of the sentence that was true, not the control version, not the management version, the actual one, the one that had been waiting on the other side of the wrong one the whole time. She gave me the time to find it. And then she made dinner, and we sat at the table with the window open, and she asked me to say it. Some things need the closed door first. The conversation you can only have after you've earned it is better than the one you try to have before you have. I know that now. The hard way, as most things worth knowing go, through the wrong version of them, lived fully, until the right version becomes visible on the other side. And I know that the closed door, the one that felt like a shutdown, was actually the most generous thing she could have done. It gave me the room to get there on my own. That's rarer than it sounds, and worth more than I knew how to recognize at the time. Here's what I keep coming back to. Have you ever said something that came out as its own opposite, where what you actually felt arrived as the worst possible version of itself, and you knew it the moment it left your mouth? And underneath that, is there someone you've been careful around for so long that when something real finally came out, it came out sideways? And did they hear what you meant, or only what you said? Write it in the comments. I read all of them. I'll be there. If stories like this find you when you need them, subscribe. There's more.